stay hungry, stay foolish.
We have a copy of Hidden Truths by David Fubini up for grabs. Just sign up for the innovationshow.io newsletter and you will be in the hat to win a copy of that book. Highly, highly recommend it. Before we launch into that episode, I want to thank our sponsor, Xi, boldly transforming the future of financial services with a suite of embedded products and services, enabling customers to manage multiple payment workflows and move funds with ease. Check out Xi at helloxi.com. Today's episode provides practical knowledge that will not only help leaders do their jobs better, but will assist boards, HR, consultants, and others in working effectively with these executives. One of the book's themes is that appearance is not reality. Much has been written and discussed about the apparent roles and responsibilities of CEOs and managing directors and other leaders. Courses are taught in MBA and executive development programs that provide a lot of information about the job. Direct reports and teams also observe leaders in action. But it's not until you assume a leadership position that the reality of the position hits home. The reality is that leaders operate in a crucible, one in which emotions run high and interpersonal relationships are at risk. Being in the spotlight, not having nearly enough hours in the day to address key issues, confronting right versus right decisions, all of this ratchets up the degree of difficulty. The good news is that our guest today and his book delivers a crucial awareness about critical capabilities and issues that come with the territory. He presents essential skills that will keep leaders at the top of their game and deliver success, both professionally and within their organizations. It is a great pleasure to welcome the author of Hidden Truths, What Leaders Need to Hear But Are Rarely Told. David Fubini, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much, and thank you for having me, and thank you for that incredibly kind introduction.
It is such a gem of a book, and I was so happy to come across it, and I'm so grateful for you to come on to the show. We only have an hour together today. We could do 30 or more, and I would enjoy every second of it. But let's get into it, David. I thought before we share and start to explore some of the hidden truths, I thought we'd start with some context to share your story. And although I gave that introduction, why this book? And I've selected a little excerpt to tee you up, and I'd love you to expand upon. You said, since retiring as a senior partner at McKinsey to teach at the Harvard Business School, I've become familiar with the advice offered in business books and articles to help leaders. I must admit that many of these works have left me a bit disappointed. While their authors offer interesting insights, they do so from a vantage point that doesn't seem to reflect the reality and practical aspects of CEOs' daily lives that I have observed firsthand.
First of all, context I think is important because you offer me the opportunity. Let me just quickly tell you that I started out my life as a horrible student. I mean, just embarrassingly poor student, in part because my grandfather is a famous Italian mathematician for which there's some very famous theorem named after him. Your listeners would, if they've ever studied math, would know what I speak about. I do not. That's one indication of my lack. My father, though, was an Italian-born theoretical physicist, and then he had 6 children, of which I have 5 sisters, all of whom are brilliant and smarter than I am and more professional than I am. So I've always been a student of trying to understand and learn from others who are smarter and more adaptive and frankly more successful than myself. So that's a little bit of where the sort of roots of where I come from. So eventually, after Harvard Business School, I found my way to McKinsey. Unlike most of my students who think they'll stay for 3 years, I ended up staying for 34 years. And so here I am back at Harvard again. But to the question you asked, yes, you read a lot of leadership books, as I seek to do, to learn and get and improve. And you realize that many of these books, they're terrific because they're a summary of one person's life and journey and what they have experienced. But very little collective sense has ever been created. And that's when I stepped back and said, well, wouldn't it be great if we collected the collective view of what CEOs and leaders experience rather than the individual view that you get from reading generally the leadership books by former executives. And so it was my, desire to try and summarize that. And that's how come the book came to be born. And I was mindful of the fact that, and let's be clear to your listeners, I've never been a CEO. I've never been the most leadership I ever had was to run the Boston office of McKinsey and our merger practice globally. But anybody who's run a professional service firm knows that that's really, you don't really run anything. You largely plead and try and, shepherd some people around towards a common objective and hope they follow. That's not what we're speaking about here. But I think the point is that this was a chance to really understand what CEOs were experiencing in real life. I went back and did a lot of interviews. I would take the table of contents and say, does this resonate for you? And they would say, oh, incredible. I mean, that one is really important. And they'd always point at something different. And so I knew I was onto something. So that's how the book got born.
And I wanted to just draw a little nice red thread. It only goes up the hall from you there, David, in the Harvard Business School, to a great friend of the show and one of our most popular episodes ever with your friend and friend of the show, Hubert Holy. Let's tell our audience a little bit about your connection there.
Hubert and I worked at McKinsey for a long time, overlapped for a good deal of time. We only knew of each other reputationally because he working primarily in Europe, me working primarily outside of Europe, didn't really have a lot of interaction. But McKinsey has a way of evaluating senior partners that requires us to basically have somebody from outside our region come in and get to know you and understand you and evaluate how well you're doing on behalf of the firm. I had the great honor to actually be the person that was Hubert Holy's evaluator in that context, and we got to know each other as a result. And so, it's unusual to have a relationship born out of one where you're being evaluated by that person, but indeed we struck up a relationship. He obviously went on to greatness at Carlson and then at Best Buy. And when he was thinking about what to do after Best Buy, working with several faculty colleagues here, we had several conversations about what the reality was of teaching here at Harvard Business School, because by that time I'd been here for several years. And I was thrilled to have him come join me and others on the faculty. And we have had a wonderful set of collaborations ever since.
I was telling you, another friend of the show is also your McKinsey alumni, your McKinsey brethren. It's a guy called Charles Conn and his book, Bulletproof Problem Solving. And I was struck always by the humility of people who work in McKinsey and the willingness to call things out, to call out the unspoken truths. And usually, David, I wear a pin to reflect the show, but it's so warm over here. I don't know what it's like for you, but it's the warmest day ever, the day I'm recording here in Ireland, in history. And that's not a good thing, obviously, with the planet, because we don't know where that's going. But the pin I chose was, I'm going to hold it up to the camera there. Hopefully you can see it. It's a monkey covering their mouth, as in speak no evil. And I was like, that's perfect for what David's talking about here. Before we get into those unspoken truths or hidden truths, I want to talk about the dual transformation or adaptation that takes place when a leader assumes a new office. And I think people in organizations, we often hold the CEO in a kind of a hero-like scaffolding where we think, oh, look at them. They don't have the same problems we do. They're human beings. And they have to first adjust to the role if they haven't been CEO before. And even if they have, changing company or even getting hired from within is a huge challenge and huge adjustments. But then the other one is the adjustment of the organization to their leadership style. So I'd love you to riff on that one, David.
One of the things that you find out when you talk to new leaders is that all the things that they did to work through a career path that created lots of wonderful financial as well as operational results for their company. They learned how to, run a team and how to, meet a budget, and then how to succeed, then how to run multiple businesses and the business units, and learn to be a strategic business unit head and do all that. All that skill set, when you become the leader of an organization, is pretty much not helpful. It's like, oh my God, I have to learn an entirely new set of skills and abilities, and I actually have to have a totally different mindset, because as a leader, of any entity, you are really having to now influence people and to drive them towards a common objective and do so at a certain pace. And you don't really have, even though you're the leader, the direct line of responsibility to be able to say, go do this, because that you become a dictator, and in most dictatorial roles, leadership activity is short-lived. And so the first big challenge is, oh my heavens, all that I was good at, I is not going to help me in my new job. So that's really the first thing. The second thing, to your point, is that because the institution is so used to being leader-led, it's like, terrific, here she is, or here they are, we're ready, tell us what to do. And so it's like, wow, I'm being expected to know all, see all, and speak about all the issues we all have to face together. And I'm new to the role, and it's hard to say, give me a little bit of time. Even though it would be certainly welcomed in certain settings for that to happen, there's a sense of, no, I'm the big dog now. I have to be the loudest voice, and she or he suddenly jumps in, and that's where issues arise. So it's that's the trade-off that you're referring to, and that happens a lot.
And you mentioned a key word there for newly minted CEOs or leaders in any sense is, it's like I use over there when I'm reading, David, I use the Pomodoro technique. One of your fellow countrymen, Federico Cirillo, created this technique of learning the 25 minutes. And I have a sand timer that's 25 minutes. And when I was reading about this chapter, I had it on. I was like, going on. That's exactly what happens to CEOs. There's one of your fellow Harvard authors wrote a book about the first 90 days or presidency, the first 100 days. You say you do not have that luxury of time anymore. And oftentimes when you see a CEO, for example, having gardening leave between roles, you're like, they bloody well need that time to prepare. And this is a huge part. You don't have the luxury to figure things out when you arrive in the role anymore. Boards are impatient. Employees are impatient. You don't have time to go and sit with the McKinseys and come up with a strategic plan to reveal to the organization. You got to hit the ground running.
It's incredibly important. And one of the things as I walked around and asked leaders, which of the book's chapters resonate, one of them that they pointed to is just this one, which is, you are so right. The pace and expectation of change has changed, is shortened dramatically in this decade than previous decades. Part of it is, you sit on boards. I sit on boards of directors now. It used to be that it would be a failure of the board if you had to fire your CEO. Unfortunately, the way the world has evolved, it's no longer considered a failure if you fire your CEO. In some cases, it's viewed as, they're taking a strong stance. They're being a realist. They're moving on. They understand the issue. So even the boards themselves have less patience anymore. Certainly the investors have less patience because everybody cares about quarter to quarter. Activism has been a big change here because you have activists who will look at every report. Anytime you have cash that is a certain accumulation relative to your results, they're going to say, let's go take a position. So you're worried about activists. And we haven't even started to talk about employees who are basically saying, please lead us. So the intensity is great there. An example of the negative side of it, and I mentioned this in the book, is that, and this is well known, GE, when Immelt moved away from being CEO, the new CEO came in, and he said, I need some time to sort out the strategy for GE. And well understood, because by God, it is a massive company and serious challenges around. And the stock, plummeted, for the day. It was down like 5 or 7%. And stories were being written about, wow, the CEO really, is he up for the job? Can we really trust him? The investors were saying, whoa, we're a little concerned. And you contrast that to a decade, 2 decades ago, Lou Gerstner took over IBM and said, I have no strategy. And they all applauded. Everybody applauded. So that the world is entirely different now, So you have to arrive prepared.
One of the key points you make in this chapter is that you say CEOs, and I found this actually interesting for anybody going for an interview role. Oftentimes we feel like the recipient of questions, but we should be using that in a way to mine for information, to be curious, to find out what the territory is like, not the map. And one of the things you say is CEOs must use the interview phase as due diligence on the issues and needed operational changes, listening carefully and thoughtfully, even while interviewing for the role, is a critical skill and one that is too often ignored in a rush to impress. And you give a great example again in the book. And I love, by the way, your examples. And this shows the diversity of people you've met. You spent a lot of time, for example, with Jack Welch that you tell us in the book, but also with CEOs as a CEO whisperer or an advisor or a trusted advisor. And that brings a whole different perspective than the CEO, as you say, is often writing these books from a survivorship bias perspective, which totally misses so many important and latent points. But you give the example of Roger Krone, former CEO of Boeing and then Leidos. I'd love you to share how he made the transition.
Just to contextualize this, I'm on the Leidos board. We're looking for a CEO. We know we're contrasting an insider candidate with an outsider candidate. Roger Krone, who at the time wasn't CEO of Boeing, he was the CEO of Boeing's defense business, and very former CFO of all Boeing and a very accomplished man. So he arrives, and I don't think Roger would mind my saying this because he's had such a wonderful career, because obviously he ends up getting this job and he's had an enormous success, but he had a very bad first interview. And it was really disturbing. And so a number of us on the board said, well, wow, we really think this is somebody we really need to hear more from. And so one of the things we went back and we suggested to Roger is he do more homework than he may have had the chance to do before. And he went back and he did a lot more homework. He worked with some family investment bankers to actually get a better sense of where the strategy should follow through. He actually worked with he talked to several competitors. He talked to a few other board members, and he actually arrived with a plan at the next interview. And rather than having, sort of a question answer, he more sort of said, look, here's the plan I would execute as best I know it today. Obviously, I don't have perfect information, but let's have a dialogue about whether or not this feels comfortable to you. And that's the second thing that's really important in these interviews, is that it has to be a dialogue. If it's a question and answer session, it's a problem. So Roger really used a huge number of assets to arrive prepared, and as a result, ended up being selected and being a terrific CEO with a wonderful track record.
Let's share some solutions and some questions that you proposed to ask. And I loved what you said here. This will just tee up the problem. A newly promoted CEO said this to you: I thought I saw the whole chessboard. Then I took the job and realized what I was actually seeing was only a small portion of what turns out to be a three-dimensional chessboard with fully half of the board hidden from my view, which actually sums up the real problem here. Because when you're being hired as well, we have this success theater of we are a great company, come join us, etc. All the warts are hidden oftentimes to try and attract people in. Every job does that. It's like a first date. And you suggest some questions and some actions that a CEO can take before they even consider such a role.
First is that, as you've just suggested, there's no situation that you enter that you're going to have perfect information, and you should assume, because it's always going to be there. It's almost a given that there are challenges that are deeper and more robust than you may actually be able to visualize and see. And you need to ask about those. And it's rare, for those who are seeking a leadership role to say, tell me what it is that you're not telling me. Tell me what it is that is the most troublesome aspect over the last 6 months for what you've achieved, that you're having to work on as an institution, as an executive team, as a board. You have to ask those questions, presuming that there are challenges, rather than asking for challenges. If you ask for challenges, you're going to get pablum. But be presumptive to say, look, I know there's challenges. Let's talk about them. It's an entirely different way to approach the question. So that's the first thing you have to do. The second is to make sure that you are not just dealing with the sort of the financial and operational issues, because those are pretty much well known in today's world. Between all the analyst communities and all third parties who look at most public companies or even some private companies, much of that is known. What you really wanted to get at is the texture of the institution. Tell me how you make decisions. Tell me what's the culture and not just culture, because that term gets thrown around for so many different things. But what's important here? What are the key processes that we actually every month need to be great at to be successful? Those are questions that rarely get asked. If you ask those questions, you'll learn more about the organization than you would otherwise. Third is you have to talk to lots of people, much like Roger did. Go to the friendly investment banker. I assure you they'll be helpful because they'll want your business after you become CEO. Go to McKinsey. I assure you they desperately want to help you when you become CEO. They will help you, Bain, BCG, Deloitte, your favorite consulting firm. Go and spend time with, those who are industry practice leaders in the industry you're going to. Tell me what I need to know about this company. If you have colleagues who used to serve, supply and or be a customer of that entity, go talk to them. And I have to tell you, it's hard work, and much as Roger found out. And I think you have to do that, and it's hard to do that because people want to say, "Well, look what I got told." The situation that you described, this particular individual spent almost 3 weeks doing analysis of the company. And still, when he arrived, he was shocked to find that the operational and manufacturing supply chain was seriously broken. He kicked himself. He said it was really not a key element of his due diligence, and he paid the price. But also, the board failed in not exposing that to him. The headhunter search firm failed in not sort of exposing that to him. And so everybody's at fault.
You talked about something that was really interesting. I thought we'd share because I wanted to share this with all our audience, no matter what level of a company you're in. And hopefully we'll get to talking about mentorship later on. But even when we were talking there was many people we knew in common, because the more people you know in a network, the more nodes of the network connect. And it's such an essential skill. And one of the first CEOs I worked under, he told me, don't spend all your time in the office. Get out there. Like Steve Blank would say in entrepreneurship, get out of the building. It's such a crucial part to meet people, build networks. Because later on, for example, when you're a CEO, you tell us, you need to tap that network because you'll get truths there that you won't hear anywhere else.
Oh, absolutely. Well, the first of all is that there's several reasons you want to get out there. One is to build your personal network. And one of the things you'll find out is other CEOs, and this is something we might come back and talk about, are pretty isolated. And so they really do enjoy talking to other leaders because there's a shared interest there. There's a shared learning. It's one of the great things you learn about Harvard is one of the great powers you have in an institution like Harvard is that you can convene, groups of people who otherwise wouldn't be convened, and they come together and they have a spectacular time, not because we're actually brilliant faculty, but to get leaders to do that is really hard, in part because it's exposing, because they are sort of saying, I don't know everything. Tell me what I need to know. That's very exposing for CEOs. Two, they can always use the excuse of time because they never have it. So that's part of the other challenge here. And three, they really don't know what will be the effect of having asked to talk to somebody because they're like, well, are they going to somehow talk to other people? And it's probably better if I don't do it. They just write scenarios that are negative. So my role often was to say, no, this will be great. And let me tell you, I know these people. This is a relationship you'll value not just on the question at hand, but the questions that will follow. It's really difficult though. So one, just getting CEOs to do that is challenging. The second thing is also to say to them, look at when you role model by walking around, it's incredibly powerful. And CEOs will say, nobody cares. And I say, no, you don't understand. Every day, what you do is watched by many, many people. So, so use that. It's an incredible tool and it's underused. And it's certainly something that isn't well understood. And again, CEOs have all the reasons to say, I don't want to do that because I have to go be exposed. And the best CEOs are the people who would say, look, I learned the most from the the individual who was assigned to drive me around from plant to plant, I learned more from the driver, than the presentations at the plant, because they're open, they're candid, and they're probably junior. My God, that's a gift. Take it, use it. And very few people do that. So it's a little bit of openness, willingness to put yourself at risk, and an assumptive behavior that you're going to really get feedback from your CEOs that you like.
There's an interesting thing, though. I was thinking about how, and thankfully the world's changing, but that whole idea of the leader, the Gordon Gekko in Wall Street type, powerful, strong, not a very nice person, never smiles. And you even see this, I've noticed this when a lot of people do photo shoots. The CEO will often go, do I smile or not? Should I not? Etc. What does that portray? And the reason I'm saying that is, even though that seems trivial, is that in the past, a leader showing any kind of weakness, like I have no strategy, like you mentioned, was actually attacked. There was snakes in the grass. There was snipers on the roofs. They were out to undermine that CEO as well. So it leaves newly minted CEOs in a weird position. They don't know how to act.
And I think this is an important point that is a red thread through the whole book. And it's because it's certainly a lived experience, and it's something I've been reading more about, which is empathy is an incredibly powerful tool for leadership and grossly undervalued. And you can show empathy by showing vulnerability. And most leaders do not see that connection. And I'd urge them to go back and rethink that. The best way to get people to sort of want to be drawn to you is to say, I don't know, help me. Or, tell me what you know, because I need to understand it. Any reach out which shows vulnerability, empathy, leaders, benefit from that. And unfortunately, it's a little bit more like old school. No, I have to be the strong and dominant force here. And while I may not know all, follow me anyhow. And that's old. That's old. And so empathy is something that we really need to see more of in our leaders.
And we'll talk later on, hopefully, probably in the next session that we do together, about boards as well, because that has to be reflected downwards as well and upwards.
Entirely. This is certainly one of the great, I think, broken relationships in the corporation, is that one between board and leader.
I'm going to hold up my little pin here of the of the monkey covering its mouth, because this is what we're going to talk about next. So you've gone through all your due diligence, you've followed David's book, you've done all his checklist in chapter 1, you've got the role. Now, maybe you've been hired from within. You think, oh, I have tentacles throughout the organization. I have sensors everywhere, people who will tell me what's going on the floor. That is not the truth anymore. As soon as you take that office, it gets very, very lonely. People stop telling you what's really going on. And this is a massive challenge. And this, for me, is one of the biggest takeaways from the book.
I really love this little story that Admiral Srividas, who's formerly was the head of the Fletcher School of Management here at Tufts University, and I got to know him as a result of that. Previously was the NATO commander, and now is at Carlisle. And but he the former NATO commander, he said, "Listen, David, I knew that when I went to the bridge of a major battleship on a visitation, that I knew two things with absolute certainty: I would never be handed a cold cup of coffee ever, and two, I would never learn the true state of the ship in that meeting, because I will not learn it." And that is true for all leaders. You'll be treated with deference and lots of accolades, but you're not going to learn the entire truth from any executive group. It just doesn't happen. It's human nature. There's the hierarchical challenge. There's the fear of losing one's job. There's the fear of, listen, I might be speaking openly, but the person next to me, she or he may not do the same. And suddenly I'll feel like I'm on an island. And it's just natural. And so again, leaders have to say, I know that's going to happen. And so I'm going to be more probing. I'm going to be more willing to hear alternative views. I want the alternative views. And there are lots of stories, and most of them are somewhat, I don't think operationally ever really happen, where CEOs stand up and give awards for those who actually are the most challenging to them. Frankly, I don't think that's realistic. This is a day-to-day, week-to-week sort of thing, and you've got to earn the trust from your colleagues, but never assume you're getting told the entire truth. It will not happen.
I experienced this myself in my career, as did you, and I'd love you to share your story from the 80s with General Motors. But my own one was I got severely punished for speaking the truth, and this was in the sports career. But then I do believe it's in your DNA. If you're high on fairness, if you gotta call it. And I have to say, and to anybody listening who is struggling with this, speaking up, you'll never ever regret A, standing up for yourself, or B, standing up for what you think's right. It will eat you away later on in life if you don't. And it's one of the real reasons this book spoke to me so much. But you had this challenge yourself where even when you do speak the truth, it's often not well accepted. We know that, but then not enacted, even when it has millions or billions of dollars on the line.
This is an old story, but it's still true today. And it's a formative story for me. So early on in my career, I was serving General Motors. This is in the early 80s. And General Motors had been shocked by the introduction of the minivan by Chrysler. Came out of nowhere. Lee Iacocca was famous for this. Anybody can go Google it, they'll find the story. It's amazing. So at the time, GM is caught flat-footed. So they immediately say, well, we have to respond. So the first thing they do is they take their cargo van and they put passenger seats into it and they call it a minivan. Understandable, but do it. Second thing, they go to their design studio and they say, create a new minivan that will be really a dominant force, a la we at GM, because at that time they had almost 40%, maybe 45% share of the US market. And they designed something which, again, your listeners would have to go and just Google Dustbuster minivan, and you'll see a picture of the Chevrolet Lumina. And this thing has more glass in its windshield than any vehicle, I think, ever. And so in order to test this radical design, they go to and they put these mock-ups in a big convention center, and they invite consumers to come in and look at it. And these consumers came in and looked at this, and then we have, sessions where we watch through two-way mirrors for what they say. And they hated this minivan. I mean, they just hated it. One participant said, look, if I put my sunglasses on the dashboard and went down a hill, I'd have to wait to go back up a hill before they would return to me. And they're absolutely accurate, by the way. Another former history teacher said, I looked at that sea of glass and thought I was Balboa looking at the Pacific Ocean for the first time. So we're on the plane flying back with all these engineers from this. And the conversation is clearly, what are we going to say to management? Because this was bad by any measure, it was bad. So, when we left, it was in California. So by the time we got to Chicago, it was, really wasn't that bad. And by the time we got to Detroit, it was, I think what we should just do is focus on these 2 or 3 minor things that we should probably change. And it was just incredible, the sort of the rewriting of history that took place. We go and have a presentation to the senior management of the North American operation. And basically it's like, it was great. It was good. We have a few things we have to tinker with. And I'm aghast because they are clearly in deep trouble. And it's understandable. They have two vehicles. They're the largest manufacturer out there. They have the scale of General Motors. Of course, they think they're going to win. And I, was a very young consultant. I stood up and I said, I have an entirely different view based on what I heard. I think this is going to be an enormous challenge. I think this particular design itself is highly challenged, and we heard that. And I think you need to rethink this. And I remember the head of North America at the time said, "Thank you, David, for that point of view. I wish you had more automotive experience to understand how naive you sound." And they of course proceed. And any of your listeners can see this is one of the great product failures of all time. They lost a whole generation to Chrysler minivans, and it took a long time for them. But this is the reality of corporate America. And you can say, okay, it's 1980s, it's General Motors, just dismiss it. I would urge you not to. This has been repeated time and time again.
It's such a great example, and I'm so glad you were there. And I love the way this happens in life where that happened to you and you did not know that would make the pages of a book you'd write in the future. Isn't that, I just think that's beautiful. Like those challenges pay off. They do when you stand up for what's right. I really believe that, David.
But there's career risk with this, and there's lots of, but that it helped me understand, by the way, that's what consultants do. Really good consultants are those who speak truth. But more importantly, it was just that how challenging and how deeply, resistant these chief engineers who knew that this was not going to work, but could not feel comfortable enough to say it. It was watching their personal struggle was interesting.
Now, if I recall from that part you were writing about, this is really, really relevant to our audience. So a lot of our audience would be chief innovation officers, heads of R&D, working in new product development, new business model development. And one of the biggest challenges, as you know, is you are struggling to get a new idea born, and the organization, the status quo, the corporate immune system will be out to get you. So when you do get something through the filter, when you get something through the sieve, you end up really loving that idea. It's like the IKEA effect, the bias of the IKEA effect. You built it. This was your baby. You got it through. You battened off all these people and you get it through. And then you fall in love with the idea. And even when it's not right, you still cling to that. And there was an interesting thing, if I recall, with those R&D guys you talked about, was they told you, we didn't join to do focus groups. We joined to build things.
Exactly. And they were so thrilled because the design of this was radical. I mean, this very radical front end and this huge piece of windshield, which was going to give the driver this wonderful vista. And they were just taken by the technology that was required to do it, rather than ever asking the question, is it, well, do consumers want it or like it? And unfortunately, engineers sometimes say we can do it. Designers say, look, they'll learn to love it because we love it, and it's just it's so radical, it's too new, they can't appreciate it, and you suddenly convince yourself of these things because you're right, you're not willing to challenge your fundamental beliefs, and that's also part of the truth, is that you've just got to, always recognize that your belief is not that which would be held by large populations of people sometimes.
So if you're a CEO, listen to this, you're going, yeah, my people won't tell me the truth, and you're pointing the finger. You got to remember, when you point the finger, there's three pointing back at you. And David, I've two pins. I've one with the mouth covered, the speak no evil, and then I have another one, hear no evil, because you say it takes two to tango, and sometimes the CEOs don't want to hear the truth. They lock themselves away, etc. So maybe we'll share this. No,
this is important too, because many will say, "Oh, I'm open to this. Please tell me." And you find out that they say that, but when they actually get the bad news or news that challenges them, they react defensively. They question the motives of the individual rather than the substance of what they're saying, and so suddenly they shut it down, and it becomes, you reinforce a behavior of let's not speak to her or him directly, because look what happened to Sam or Sally. And it happens too frequently. There's an example in the book where, an executive who really said, I am welcome to let anything come forward, finds out that one of his executives is in conversation with one of his more junior executives about the CEO and how unwilling, in this case, he is to take tough stands, and how he waffles, and how to overcome that. And the reaction wasn't to sort of say, oh, my heavens, I missed that, I should be listening to them. His reaction was he fired the junior individual. And, of course, everybody in the building knows within 2 hours that this has happened. And he's suddenly surprised that nobody wants to talk to him anymore. Well, this is, frankly, my younger children could have figured that one out. It's a real problem so you've got to really not just say it, you have to actually, in your being, want to have that input. Otherwise, it will not happen. I love how you put this. Our reflex to please and pamper leaders rather than risk upsetting them with bad news is deeply ingrained. And it's encouraged, consciously or not, just like you said, by leaders, by their actual behavior.
And you say here, I love this story, Shakespeare dramatized these behaviors in King Lear. And I absolutely love this analogy.
I'm not a Shakespearean scholar in any form or fashion. One of my other colleagues pointed this one out to me, so I don't mean to take credit for it in any way. But the notion of, having children, who as a parent, you want to hear all the great things, and then the one child who actually speaks the truth, you end up banishing. Is something that is a lesson that CEOs really need to understand and listen to. And it's unfortunate. It's not just CEOs, all leaders, and it's of all type. We don't like being challenged. We don't like, particularly when we're parents. Like we feel like there's an ownership here. In the story I told about the individual who fired the more junior person, this was a close confidant of his. He was hurt by the fact that they were sending nasty emails and wasn't being truthful. Rather than going and sitting with the individual and saying, "I thought we had a relationship. Speak to me directly about that," he comes and fires them. That's the King Lear effect. And so that's the analogy that I was trying to draw upon.
I loved it. It reminds me of my own family. my kids are 12 and 9, like I was telling you before. I had 2 boys. And the younger one is just like just give you the truth like it is. Or else, you do something for him and he's kind of like, he's grateful, but he doesn't make a big deal about it. And you're kind of like fishing for compliments. You're like kind of going, "Did you like what Daddy did there?" And he's like going, "Yeah, I told you already."
That's why the analogy of children is so great, because they don't think about all the nuance and all. They're just telling you the truth. They're just saying, "Hey, Dad, my daughter would say, Dad, that's an ugly shirt. Don't wear that."
It's my wife who does that for me. She's the best mirror I ever need. Just straight to, no empathy, just bang, tell you the truth.
And by the way, it happens all the time. I mean, just upon one of my first days here at Harvard, I showed up to Harvard and I was wearing a lanyard with my ID on it because I'd seen another faculty do that. And I thought that's how we did things here at Harvard. And I went to go see one of my old professors who was still teaching here. And I walked in and I said hi to him, and he said, "David, what do you take that lanyard off? What are you doing?" He said, "You look like like you're a rank rookie here. Put it away. We don't need to wear our credentials around our necks." And I was thinking, what a brilliant thing to do. I mean, I could have been wearing that thing around for days and I looked like a silly man. He's like, no, just take that thing off. It was the very first thing he said. We hadn't seen each other in 30 years. He's like, "Oh my God, what are you wearing that around your neck for?" You want people to do that for you and welcome it, rather than feel like, "Oh my God, could you say hi first?" No, he's teaching me.
And it builds trust, doesn't it? Like your trust with him increases
exponentially. He'll always tell you. So, and there's many examples at McKinsey of people giving really good feedback and people giving bad feedback to clients as well as to individuals. And I do think it differentiates in life as well.
I have one to share with you. I was running a program for an organization and it was on having difficult conversations. And my fly was down, David. And for an hour, nobody said it to me. And I said, like, why did I just called it out. I was like going, why did nobody say it? And they're like, "Oh, didn't want you to make you feel bad." It's like, this is about having difficult conversations.
It couldn't be a better example of just what we're speaking of. But people edit themselves, right? We're trying to please. We're not trying, and it happens even in the Harvard classrooms where we have 93 MBA students. And I'll say, look, you have to have open and direct and candid conversations, not mean-spirited, but open and direct. And you have to challenge each other. And they're like, it takes them almost half a semester before they really understand that. And I keep saying this is the safest room in the world you ever be in, because nobody's ever going to speak about what happens in this room. There's no social media. There's no nothing. Just be, and you're stuck together for your lives. Be open and be candid. And even then, it takes them time.
Yeah, it's so difficult for people, but it's so hard. Essential, isn't it? We need everybody to be.
But good leaders draw people to them and get them to do this. Really good ones.
So you're a new leader. You're in the role. You're trying to figure stuff out. We've called out these things. David then shares some of the roadblocks, and one of them is like the hot hand fallacy. What you did before will work again for you now in the future. And you say roadblock number 1 is believing too much in your past successes. You shared the story here of Ron Johnson.
Ron Johnson is again, I should say to Ron, who I've only been in a classroom with him, I've never met him. He's very good to let us use this as an example because he was wildly successful at Kmart and then again at Apple, running the retail operations at created Apple stores that we now all go to and use. That's all Ron Johnson's doing, at least attributed to him. And he goes to become the CEO of JCPenney, and he shows up, with a few members of his team and takes over JCPenney. And I think by any objective measure, fails quite spectacularly. Not without huge challenges. Obviously, the retail environment has been changing, as we all know, with online. He has an activist, who's basically running the board, and he is trying to do this in an environment where JCPenney was very sort of collegially run by its former organization, the former CEO, and he didn't have time to really change out all that cultural. So he struggled. But the fact is, he believed in so strongly in his concept of what was necessary that he not only put it in place, he did not test it. He put it in place across all of JCPenney units. The concept was fundamentally flawed. It ran against JCPenney's traditional customer base, the traditional way of people buying, and he failed. And it's because nobody questioned, including himself, whether or not his views learned from his past behavior would work here. And they failed for really three reasons. One, he had a natural presumption about how people would shop that doesn't translate to the JCPenney customer. Bad. Two, he did it without any sort of testing. And three, he did it because he's now the CEO and not the head of marketing. And it's really hard when you're the CEO and not the head of marketing, because now you've got to marshal the entire organization towards that vision, and he failed to do that. And so he called it situational arrogance that prevented him from being able to succeed. I'll leave it to others to judge whether that was alone what it was. But there's a classic case of failure. Little postscript also. He brought several people along with him from Apple. And I always wondered, why didn't those people say to Ron Johnson, who knew him well, obviously, and I'm sure were brought along to help him in this change? Why didn't they say, Ron, this is probably too risky, too fast, and not on strategy. Let's rethink this. And I've never understood why they would have stopped it. But again, speaking truth, they didn't even do it, even though they were brought from Apple to help him. I've never met them, but I'm assuming they could have done that.
David, I love it. I'm going to share a little image here to tee us up for the next one, and hopefully you'll have a little chuckle for yourself here. This one stems from a story that you tell about another one of your stories. This time it's with GM again, and this is about an unwillingness to acknowledge frightening realities. And another better one, a more comical one, is that image there, where everything around you is falling down, and you're like, going, it's all fine up here in the boardroom, and ultimately it isn't. And this is such a unfortunately common aspect of decline and disruption in organizations.
The GM example is much like that golfer with the forest fire behind them. So focused on, if they get the putt, they can win the game, as opposed to the reality of what's about to overtake them. So the wonderful, metaphorical, lead in. The issue is that it's really hard sometimes when you're not being told the entire truth, and you're limited in your ability to have gone out and talked to lots of other people. You're focused on just your senior team and what they're telling you, to sometimes see the reality of your situation, a la the forest fire that's behind the golfer. In GM's case, the head of North America, was so driven by, in this case, the putt was, if I keep my market share, I will be successful in the marketplace, because they traditionally had always had that. They were market share oriented. And one of the ways that he propped up, and I was propping up his market share, was selling increasingly larger number of products to rental fleets, who would keep them and rent them out, and then effectively GM would buy them back, or third parties would buy them back, and they go back in the market and create a secondary market for used cars. But that was revenue only gained for 6 or 7 weeks until they were turned back in. And so it was well known to many that this was increasingly larger amounts of the total volume that was being done for some of the car units. Also, they were very reliant on discounting and putting more and more inventory out into the field. I remember I was interviewing one of the key dealers in Washington. And I said, "Tell me, how is GM doing?" He said, "I'll tell you this, I'm just buying gravel everywhere." And I went, "Well, what does that have to do with GM?" He says, "I'm putting gravel on football fields to park the cars I'm having to buy from them." And you're in trouble when you're doing that. So all this by way of saying, we did the analysis as one would expect from a good consultancy. And I sat with the head of the North American operation. I said, "Look, you are in serious trouble, because let me just show you the numbers of what this is going to continue, if this continues to be." And his basic concept was, "No, David, if I have the market share, we will be successful." And I remember saying to him at the time, I know I'm really over my skis because I'm still a young guy. I'm just at this point in time, I think I was a brand new partner. I said, "I fear that this will be a conversation that will rue when you go back, because you're going to lose your role. You're going to be asked to step aside if these numbers come to fore." And they did come to fore. He was asked to step aside. And we all know that General Motors struggled in that time period, and it frankly has struggled in many ways since. So I'm not suggesting this was the turning point, but it's an important point to say, even in the face of lots of data, lots of analysis, any number of people could have told, in this case, this gentleman that time was challenged, he ignored it all.
David, there's a brilliant next one. So we're on roadblocks here to the full picture, and I thought I'd share again as a little lead-in, very short. This is an advertisement from the Guardian newspaper in the UK from 1986, 1987. And I thought it was just so excellent. I use it in my courses about communication, and I'd love to share it with you. So I'm going to just put it up on screen now, and I'll press play.
An event seen from one point of view gives one impression. Seen from another point of view, it gives quite a different impression. But it's only when you get the whole picture you can fully understand what's going on.
I thought it was brilliant to share that, to bring this one to life, because many of our audience, again, work in innovation. Oftentimes they're put into an innovation silo. It originally was developed to break down the silos, and then it becomes a silo of itself. And then you have sales not speaking to marketing. And then you have all this fragmentation of not only the people in your organization, but the information, and you cannot get a holistic picture.
I love the example, because it drives home the point of, in many organizations, there are silos, as you described. We can manufacture it. Great. We actually have the ability to put it into the warehouses and get it out. Great. We can actually sell it because customers see the promise of this. But yet, very few people look across the entirety and say, does it all make sense? Much like the perspective you get when you see a pull-away shot of that gentleman saving the man from the bricks. And so the problem is, because we're so focused on trying to get effectiveness within the functions and efficiencies, we don't look at the bigger picture. And people don't have the time for it, and they don't ask the tough questions. There's an example in the book of a very well-known company that was highly successful making, in this case, most offices in the United States have machines that actually use pods to make coffee. And so they're wildly successful doing this. And then the thought was, well, what else could we make with the same technology? Well, let's make soda. Let's make soda because now we go from hot to cold. And so we'll make a soda. And indeed, there was a manufacturing design that said we can create this machine. We can put carbon monoxide into the water and we can create soda. And there was a marketing group that said, oh my heavens, people definitely would buy this. And there's a financial group that says, yes, we can afford to do this. And particularly because we'll get all the big soda companies. And the fact is, it was all being designed. And there was somebody who was the product manager across the whole of it. And in this case, they were somebody I was speaking with, and they knew things were not as they seemed. And I said, you've got to speak up. You've got to tell them that this is not true. Part of the challenges were the manufacturing was coming along slowly. It turns out this machine is large. It takes up an enormous amount of space in the kitchen, which people do not have. Third, it turns out to be very expensive, and so the long story is that it didn't get understood because the product manager who was put across these things didn't have the power and influence to call the question. And it goes to the consumer show, before the Christmas rush, and it gets terribly badly received, and eventually becomes a major failure. But it's not the issue that it's failed. This issue is that nobody listened to the person cutting across the units. So nobody got the picture, the 30-dimensional, faraway picture of the gentleman, being about to have the bricks fall on their head. That's what people need to miss. And the leadership needs to understand that picture is important, even though they may be the more junior people in the overall process.
And I think that's such a key one, because oftentimes you get a leader and they're so far removed from the people in the trenches that they have no way to communicate with them. And then, as we'll talk about the next day, we won't have time to get there today, they're so time strapped that they have so many people dragging out of them from each different direction that they don't have time to even be present mentally, let alone physically, with the person when they're actually with them. But we'll go there the next day. So we've been talking about, okay, previously to getting into the role, you get the role, then you realize, I'm not getting all the information, etc. But what do you do about it? And David addresses this in spades within the book. You share how to move from partial to whole truths. You say here, once you understand that truth is often hidden behind ingrained habits and attitudes, it may seem very daunting to reverse that culture. And I absolutely, totally get that. It's nearly easier to just ignore it and go on and focus on making the putt, like David said earlier on, but it can be done. However, David shares some ways to get the ball rolling. And maybe at a high level, David, as a final message for this episode, will share what those ways to get the ball rolling are.
We've touched on several of these approaches, but just to reinforce them. The first is you have to, know that you're not getting the entire truth and find a way to delve and find that truth. Some CEOs, create red teams and ask multiple people to do multiple efforts. I find those somewhat discouraging, but that's certainly one approach. That's a more hard-ass approach, excuse my language, but to do it. But I think really just recognizing that you need to ask and get a more integrated view. So it's easy to do that because you can ask, in this case, the project manager for an integrated view. If need be, do it without the others in the room. Just because you deal with the reality that sometimes openness comes with fewer people in the room. The second is ask go and talk more to your customers and say, well, I'm glad you want this, but do you have room in your kitchen for it? I mean, and there are wonderful stories of consumer packaged goods companies who are wildly successful because they actually have people live in people's homes. Well, we'll emulate that by trying to ask the tough questions. And then, of course, actively sampling and understanding of the product really of value yourself, because people will give you lots of data, but the point is you have to be convinced yourself. So really be much more thoughtful about finding ways to actually do it. You also want to reward people. Now, I'm not saying you pay for truth, but you certainly celebrate that. And you can do that through subtle means by saying, look at, Sally came to me and told me of this issue. I can't tell you how great it is for all of us that we now have that view. And now Sally feels good, and all the rest of them go, okay, see, she or he is really willing to hear that. And it doesn't have to be you pay for people for that or you give them some award. You just make that part of your day-to-day conversation. Another example, of how to actually celebrate this is I'm now on a board where actually Roger Krone, again, speaking of Roger, actually now at every board meeting stands up and says, here's what went well and here's what went badly. I mean, he literally says, this is where I'm disappointed in what we did. How easy is that? I mean, it just changes the whole tenor of our conversation as a board because he's open and candid. Not too many CEOs do that. So that's another way to do it. And I think, the other is that you have to, be thankful for that which you're hearing rather than being dismissive of it. It's easy to say, okay, that was a tough message. I'm glad you told me that. and we'll take it under advisement. Well, that's as good as saying, I'm ignoring you entirely and that was worthless. As opposed to saying, that's incredibly difficult for me to hear. It will cause us to have to rethink things, and that's a good thing. You want to play that back. You have to force people to hear that you are willing to, and you're going to be positive in your reactions. So that's another way to do it. And the final thing is that you always have to say, there's a micro and a macro view of every problem. And if you focus on one at the expense of the other, you'll be in trouble. So always look at both the micro and the macro view, not just one or the other. And really great leaders do that as a matter of course. But you can be too micro, in which case it's like, okay, fine, you do it. You're going to make every decision. Or you could be too macro. Oh, she doesn't care, so we'll just go ahead and ignore it.
Beautiful, David. We'll wrap up today's episode because we're going to come back for a part 2. And in that part 2, we're going to cover how do you create a nice constituency, people who are engaged and open and willing to share the hard truths. And then the second thing is, and this one's lovely, is like, do you start change management by changing management? Huge question that's often thought about, very seldom addressed very clearly, and David definitely does that within the book. David, before we wrap up today's episode, where can people find you?
I'm pretty easy to find. Just if you go to the Harvard website, look up, old guy from McKinsey, Harvard, you'll see me. But yes, it's, eminently easy to find me at dfubini@hbs.edu. You won't remember that, but go to the Harvard faculty website. Just send me an email. They come right to me. I'll find you, and I would enjoy hearing from you.
Awesome. And I'll share that page on the show notes as well. Don't forget, I have a copy up for grabs, but I do highly recommend, no matter what type of role you're in, CEO, board member, or CIO, Chief Innovation Officer, or in any role within an organization, absolutely great book. The author of Hidden Truths, What Leaders Need to Hear But Are Rarely Told, David Fubini. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you for having me. I very much enjoyed it.
Nice one, man. That was brilliant. Don't forget to sign up to the innovationshow.io newsletter, where you will be in the hat to win a copy of David Fubini's Hidden Truths. Before we finish, I want to thank our sponsors, boldly transforming the future of financial services with a suite of embedded products and services, enabling customers to move funds with ease and manage multiple payment workflows. Check out Zai at hellozai.com. I'll see you very soon.